On April 4, 1945, General George Patton's 4th Armored Division entered Ohrdruf, the first concentration camp discovered by the US Army on German soil. Soldiers found bodies piled up, some covered with lime and others partially burned on makeshift pyres. 8 days later, Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley and Patton himself toured the site in person. Patton could not bear the stench of the hangar where dozens of naked corpses lay and had to step outside to vomit. Eisenhower immediately sent a cable to Washington demanding that congressmen and journalists travel to Germany to see it with their own eyes. He knew that without witnesses, the world might refuse to believe what had happened, but they were not the first to face this discovery. On November 23, 1944, troops of General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division entered Strasbourg and searched the Anatomical Institute of the Reich University. In the basements, they found 86 Jewish bodies submerged in vats of alcohol, 57 men and 29 women deported from Auschwitz. They had been murdered under the orders of Professor Auguste, an SS captain, who intended to create a collection of skeletons to demonstrate the supposed racial inferiority of Jews. The French soldiers documented what they found, took photographs, and continued advancing. This documentary reveals what the world saw when the Nazi camps were uncovered. Himmler's decree: no prisoner must fall into enemy hands. To understand what the Allies found in the spring of 1945, one must first understand what the Nazi camp system was, how it had grown, and why it began to collapse before any Western soldier crossed its gates. It all began with a relatively simple function. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, the SS established Dachau in March of that same year, followed shortly after by Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen and Lichtenberg. Its purpose was political: to imprison the regime's enemies, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, journalists, anyone who represented a real or imagined threat to the consolidation of Nazi power. They were instruments of internal terror, not death factories. That would change. As Germany occupied Europe and the war expanded eastward, the system transformed into something qualitatively different. Political prisoners were joined by Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, common criminals and citizens from every occupied nation. But it was the war economy that triggered the most explosive expansion of the system. The Third Reich needed labor. Armaments factories, mines, quarries and construction projects required workers that the war was consuming on the fronts. The solution was industrial-scale slave labor. The camps ceased to be political prisons and became providers of free, disposable labor. The numbers reflect this transformation with brutal precision. In September 1942, there were approximately 110,000 prisoners in the SS camps. A year later, that number had almost doubled, reaching 224,000. By January 1945, it exceeded 700,000. A camp like Gross Rosen in Lower Silesia, which had started as a secondary facility, counted by the end of 1944 more than 100 subcamps spread across the region and housed nearly 77,000 inmates, almost 11% of the Reich's entire concentration population. The system had developed tentacles extending across occupied Europe, but not all camps were the same, and that distinction is essential to understanding what the Allies would eventually discover. There were concentration camps: Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, Stutthof, designed to exploit inmates through forced labor and systematic terror. Many died there, but death was not necessarily the primary goal. Then there were pure extermination camps: Chelmno, Bełżec, Sobibor, Treblinka, facilities designed solely to kill, where trains arrived with deportees who were gassed within hours. Together, those 4 extermination centers accounted for nearly a third of all Holocaust victims. The exceptions that combined both functions were Majdanek and Auschwitz. At the latter, built in occupied Poland as a concentration camp and gradually transformed into the largest extermination center in history, around 1 million Jews were murdered in gas chambers. In the spring of 1944 alone, over the course of a few weeks, 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported there and killed. That was the system at its full operational phase. What began to occur from the summer of 1944 onward was its collapse. The turning point came from the east. In June 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that destroyed the German Army Group Center and opened an irreparable hole in the Eastern Front. Within weeks, German lines had retreated hundreds of kilometers. For the SS, which administered a network of camps across Poland, the Baltic countries, and Eastern Europe, the Soviet advance posed an urgent problem: what to do with the prisoners? Himmler's answer was unequivocal. On July 21, 1944, a decree signed under his authority explicitly ordered that no prisoner should fall into enemy hands. The intention was twofold: to prevent survivors from becoming witnesses to the crimes committed in the camps, and to keep slave labor available for the German war industry, which still desperately needed it even as the Reich was collapsing. The decree came too late for Majdanek. 3 days after it was signed, the Red Army entered the outskirts of Lublin. What Soviet soldiers found at Majdanek on July 23, 1944, was the first large-scale material evidence of the Nazi extermination machinery. The SS had had time to destroy part of the facilities, but not all. The gas chambers were almost intact. The crematoria remained standing. There was a massive reserve of human ashes, and in the warehouses, 800,000 pairs of victims' shoes stacked to the ceiling. That number alone, 800,000 pairs of shoes, conveyed something words could hardly express. The Red Army organized a formal visit for journalists 2 days after the liberation. Correspondent Konstantin Simonov broadcast his report that very night. A Soviet film crew documented the camp in a 40-minute movie that was shown in the Soviet Union and in several Allied countries. However, both the Soviet coverage and the Western reaction revealed something significant about how the world would process, or fail to process, what it was seeing. The Soviet film prioritized the suffering of non-Jewish Poles and used Christian symbolism, obscuring the fact that the majority of Majdanek's victims were Jewish. In the West, the response was skepticism. The Daily Mail published the account in quotation marks, implicitly questioning the very term extermination camp. The BBC dismissed the report by journalist Alexander Worth, who had been at the camp and seen the facilities with his own eyes, labeling it Soviet propaganda. One of the few testimonies of that liberation that escapes this ideological filter comes from Bernhard Storch, a Polish Jew who fought as part of a unit in the Red Army. His division was among those that entered Majdanek. The gas chambers were labeled bath and disinfection for sanitary reasons. Storch and his comrades entered without suspecting what those spaces were. It was only when they found the crematoria and human remains that they understood what they had been looking at. His unit was quickly moved to the front, first to Warsaw and then to Berlin. Months later, in April 1945, Storch would participate in the liberation of Sachsenhausen, and that would be the first time he freed living human beings. After the fall of Majdanek, the SS accelerated evacuations in all the camps threatened by the Soviet advance. The procedure was always the same. Prisoners who could walk were gathered into columns and marched toward the interior of the Reich. Those who could not walk were executed on the spot or simply left to their fate. In some marches, guards killed stragglers directly on the road, with no more procedure than a shot to the back of the head before moving on. These columns, which survivors would call death marches, were a way of killing in motion. Thousands of people, already weakened by months or years of hunger, forced labor and disease, walked for weeks along icy roads with minimal or no rations, sleeping outdoors in sub-zero temperatures, moving toward destinations even the guards themselves did not know for certain. Those who fell were shot. Those who tried to escape were hunted. Those who reached their destination found camps already overwhelmed, incapable of receiving them. George Kaldor, a 23-year-old Hungarian who had arrived at Auschwitz during the 1944 deportations, survived the January 1945 evacuation by a method as precarious as it was revealing. He had spent weeks in the camp infirmary with a fever, managing to stay there by artificially reopening a wound on his foot each time it began to heal, to avoid being declared recovered and sent to work. When the SS began evacuating the camp, Kaldor dressed in civilian clothes found in the warehouses and hid with another prisoner in an air raid shelter. From there, for hours, he watched columns of SS, regular soldiers, tanks and retreating German civilians pass by in disorder. When the Russians arrived and Kaldor returned to the camp, of the 400 sick who had been left behind, only about 200 survived. The rest had died of starvation and typhus in the days following the evacuation. The Soviet soldiers fed them with food taken from local villagers and told them to walk, in the state they were in, to Krakow. The destination of most of the marches was Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald or Mauthausen, camps located in the interior of Germany and Austria that received tens of thousands of people in a matter of weeks, arriving in extreme conditions. Bergen-Belsen had been designed to house, under normal operating conditions, around 10,000 inmates. In February and March 1945, its population exceeded 60,000. Water, food and sanitation collapsed. Typhus epidemics spread uncontrollably. In March 1945 alone, 18,000 people died there. One historian described Dachau in April 1945 as a camp that could no longer be distinguished from sites of mass killing. It was not rhetorical exaggeration, it was a technically accurate description of what saturation and neglect had produced. There was a cruel paradox in the composition of those who marched. Prisoners who in January 1945 were in relatively better health were not those who had received more humane treatment, but those assigned to armaments production work. Slave labor in the factories, though brutal, at least ensured a minimal ration for survival, because a dead worker produced nothing. Many of these prisoners, both Jewish and non-Jewish, had managed to stay alive until the last winter of the war. But even they did not escape the marches. The subcamps of Gross Rosen, Neuengamme or Mauthausen emptied their facilities in the final weeks of the Reich and sent their inmates in columns or on trains that took 3 weeks to reach their destination, with cars arriving full of corpses. The most documented chapter of the first Soviet liberations was not Majdanek, but Auschwitz, and what happened there on January 27, 1945, contradicts the image of heroic rescue that the date evokes in collective memory. By the time soldiers of the Red Army's 322nd Rifle Division reached the vast complex, the SS had forced about 65,000 prisoners to march westward in the previous days. The dead on that march and in the weeks before numbered tens of thousands. Inside the camp, scattered across an enormous complex, the Soviets found approximately 7,000 people too sick to have walked. They were not easy to locate. Many were unconscious in barracks where corpses and the living lay together, making it difficult to distinguish one from the other. Eva Moses Kor was 10 years old when the soldiers arrived. Years later, she would recall the scene with a precision no official report could match. They ran to the soldiers, and the soldiers gave them hugs, cookies and chocolate. That girl had survived Dr. Josef Mengeler's experiments alongside her twin sister. A hug from an unknown soldier was at that moment something that had no equivalent in her recent experience. Gerhard Durlacher, who would later become a sociology professor in Amsterdam, experienced the liberation through the fever that still consumed him. He remembered soldiers' faces peeking out like shy boys, German men and women wrapping them in grey blankets and carefully placing them in trucks. It would take him weeks to recover enough to travel back to his hometown in the Netherlands, where the reception would be cold. No one wanted to hear what he had lived through. The SS had destroyed most of Auschwitz's records before retreating, but they had not managed to destroy everything. The Soviets found in the camp warehouses 836,000 women's garments, 348,000 men's garments, and 38,000 pairs of children's shoes, along with tons of human hair prepared for industrial use. Those figures described, more eloquently than any testimony, the scale of what had occurred there. The world would take decades to fully comprehend what had been documented that January of 1945. Over the following months, the Red Army continued liberating other camps as it advanced toward Berlin. Ravensbrück, the main women's camp in the system, fell in April. Stutthof, Gross Rosen and Theresienstadt fell in May. In most of them, inmates had been evacuated before the Soviets' arrival, and what the soldiers found were those too sick to move and the physical remnants of what the camp had been. In the territories where the pure extermination camps of Treblinka, Sobibor and Bełżec had operated, the SS had had enough time to destroy the facilities. All that remained were pits, ashes and structural remnants that required interpretive effort to reveal their true nature. Soviet coverage of all these liberations was always conditioned by the political objectives of the state. Victims were presented in national terms as Soviet or Polish citizens who had suffered under the Nazi occupier, not as Jews exterminated under a genocidal policy specifically targeting them. This omission, calculated and systematic, was not merely wartime propaganda. It responded to the interests of the emerging Soviet regime, which had no interest in acknowledging the Holocaust's specificity as a crime directed against an ethnic group. The consequences of this distortion would extend for decades, contributing to delaying the understanding of the Holocaust as what it truly was. By the spring of 1945, when the Western armies began their deep advance into Germany, the camp system had been collapsing for months. What American and British soldiers would find beyond the gates was not the system in operation, but the result of its collapse. Camps overwhelmed beyond capacity, uncontrolled epidemics, mountains of corpses, and tens of thousands of survivors who had arrived after weeks of marching. Understanding this context is key to understanding why what they saw left them speechless. They were not merely discovering a crime. They were witnessing the end of a 12-year process whose true magnitude was only just beginning to become visible. What Patton's 4th Armored Division found beyond the gates. When the Allied armies crossed into Germany in the fall of 1944, most soldiers had only a vague idea of what the Nazi concentration camps were. They had read something in newspapers, heard about places where the regime imprisoned its political enemies. But that image, built from fragments of information and the experience of conventional warfare, did not at all prepare them for what they were about to find. The problem was not just ignorance, it was that no available mental framework could anticipate the scale of what the Third Reich had built over 12 years. The first Western encounter with a concentration camp on European soil occurred in November 1944, when French troops of General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division entered Natzweiler-Struthof in the Alsatian Vosges. What they found there was disturbing. Evidence of torture and executions, and in the basements of the Anatomical Institute of the University of Strasbourg, 86 Jewish bodies submerged in vats of alcohol, personally gassed by Commander Josef Kramer under the orders of Professor August Hirt, who intended to build a collection of skeletons to demonstrate Jewish racial inferiority. It was a crime of scientific coldness that should have triggered all alarms. It did not. Soldiers and reporters who entered the camp lacked the necessary context to interpret what they were seeing. They documented it, photographed it, and moved on. The camp was catalogued as an isolated case, an aberration within the broader context of a war that had already produced enough horrors. That assessment was understandable and completely wrong. The error began to become unsustainable on April 4, 1945, when elements of the 4th Armored Division of General Patton's Third Army approached a small town southwest of Weimar called Ohrdruf. What they found was not a main camp of the system, but a subcamp of Buchenwald, yet what lay inside was enough that none of the soldiers who saw it could ever think of the war in the same way again. The SS had evacuated the camp days earlier. The 9,000 inmates who could walk had been forced to march to Buchenwald. The 4,000 who could not walk had been killed or left to their fate. The Americans entered a compound where bodies were stacked everywhere, making passage difficult. One of the division's soldiers would later recall it with a precision that revealed how far his previous image had been from reality. He had heard about the camps, of course, but had imagined them as large work facilities with slave labor, 3 meals a day, and a bed at night in exchange for unpaid work. What was in Ohrdruf had nothing to do with that image. The news reached the command. On April 12, 8 days after the initial entry, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, visited Ohrdruf in person, accompanied by General Omar Bradley and Patton himself. The three were men who had seen war up close for years. None were prepared for Ohrdruf. Patton could not bear the sight of the crematoria and had to withdraw. Eisenhower toured the camp in silence, and when he left, he made a decision that would prove historically decisive. He immediately understood that what he had seen could not remain without witnesses, because he knew, with the clarity of a seasoned combatant, that when the war ended, there would be those who would deny that any of it had existed. That same afternoon, he ordered all American troops in the area who were not on the front line to visit the camp, and he sent telegrams to London and Washington urging congressmen, parliamentarians, and journalists to fly to Germany. His words in those telegrams were unequivocal. All written reports to date did not convey the full horror. He needed the world to see it with its own eyes before memory began to fade. To his soldiers, he said something even more direct. We are told that the American soldier does not know why he fights. Now at least he will know what he fights against. The day after Ohrdruf, American troops arrived at another camp in the Harz Mountains in central Germany. Dora Nordhausen was a different place from Ohrdruf, and its difference revealed something the soldiers still did not fully understand. that the camps were not improvised facilities but parts of a deliberate industrial system. Some soldiers described noticing the smell from 25 kilometers away, floating in the air in a way that only made sense when they reached the compound. There were no gas chambers at Dora Nordhausen. What existed was a network of underground factories carved into rock where thousands of slave workers had produced the V-2 rockets that the Reich launched against London and Antwerp. Prisoners worked underground in conditions of darkness, cold and extreme hunger, in shifts of up to 18 hours. The Americans found 2,700 unburied bodies and about 3,000 survivors in a state of extreme weakness. Dora Nordhausen was the demonstration of something that reporters began to articulate in those days. The camps did not exist outside the German economy. They were part of it. The very weapons that had fallen on Allied cities had been manufactured by prisoners who were dying in the process. Horror was not a side effect of Nazism, it was one of its operating mechanisms. On April 11, 1945, one day before Eisenhower's visit to Ohrdruf, troops of the American 80th Infantry Division entered Buchenwald, the main camp of which Ohrdruf was a satellite. If Ohrdruf had been the first shock, Buchenwald was the moment when the scale of the system began to become visible. Buchenwald had been established in 1937 on the Ettersberg Hills, a few kilometers from Weimar, the city representing the best of classical German culture. For almost 8 years, it had operated as a concentration camp for German political prisoners, then for Jews, then for citizens from every country Germany occupied. In the first months of 1945, with death marches depositing tens of thousands of evacuated prisoners from the east, its population had reached 44,000 people. The SS had managed to transfer 23,000 of them by train in the days prior to the American arrival. Still, when the troops entered, they found more than 20,000 people alive, in conditions ranging from extreme weakness to imminent death. Louis Blatz was 18 years old and a soldier in the 81st Division when he entered Buchenwald on April 12th. He remembered the smell above all. The crematoria still had burning bodies, and that smell permeated the entire camp. It was hard to breathe, and although it was a relief to move away, one could not forget. That mixture of relief and guilt at wanting to move away, of horror and inability to process what was seen, appears in almost every soldier's testimony from those weeks. It was not cowardice. It was the normal reaction of human beings to something for which no preparation was possible. The public dimension of Buchenwald's discovery was different from that of previous camps because Edward R. Murrow was there. The CBS correspondent was the most recognized radio voice in the United States, forged during the years of the London Blitz. His report from Buchenwald, broadcast on April 15th, began with a warning. What he was about to describe was hard to believe, and if listeners chose not to believe it, he would understand. He then described what he had seen with the precision of someone who understands that words are all he can do that day. The report shook the American audience. Murrow titled it with a figure that said it all. 900 were dying per day in the best Nazi death camp. Among Buchenwald's survivors was a 16-year-old Romanian writer named Elie Wiesel, who had arrived after the evacuation from Auschwitz in January. There were others from almost every occupied country in Europe. One of them, Baruch Gewürz, told journalist Percy Knauth that they had cursed him with the memory of all the dead, and that even if he left Buchenwald, he would never feel free. It was a phrase that soldiers and journalists were only beginning to understand. The physical liberation of a camp did not free those who had survived in it. Eisenhower ordered German citizens from the region to visit Buchenwald. He wanted German witnesses, convinced that later denial would be inevitable without them. The mayor of Weimar and his wife toured the camp. She said she had known nothing. He committed suicide days later. As the armies advanced into eastern and southern Germany over the following weeks, discoveries accumulated at a pace that left no time for processing. Each camp confirmed what the previous one had hinted at. These were not isolated incidents, they were nodes in a network. On April 23rd, the American 90th Infantry Division liberated Flossenbürg in Bavaria. When the Americans arrived, the path to the compound was littered with corpses. What made Flossenbürg particularly revealing, however, was what had happened there days before. The SS had executed Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, General Hans Oster, and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, among other conspirators against Hitler, to eliminate witnesses in the final hours of the regime. The camp system had not been only a machine of mass extermination, it had also been the regime's private prison for its own internal enemies. On April 15, 1945, the British Army's 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment arrived at a camp in northern Germany, near the town of Bergen, which would become the most recognizable symbol of the liberations for the British public. Bergen-Belsen had not been designed as an extermination camp. It had been opened in 1943 for prisoners that the Reich considered useful as bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations. That original function did not explain what the soldiers found when they crossed the gates. The collapse of the Eastern Front had turned Bergen-Belsen into the final destination for tens of thousands of survivors of the death marches, evacuated from Auschwitz-Birkenau, Stutthof and Gross-Rosen. SS administration had disintegrated weeks earlier. There was no running water or functional sanitation. Epidemics of typhus, tuberculosis and dysentery spread unchecked. In March 1945 alone, 18,000 people had died there. Captain Derek Sington was one of the first British officers to enter. He had tried to mentally prepare himself for what he might find, but discovered that such preparation was useless. He described a crowd pressed against the barbed wire, with shaved heads and the striped camp uniforms, which to his eyes seemed stripped of all recognizable humanity. It was an observation that reflected both the state of the survivors and the observer's difficulty in processing what he saw. Sington noticed something else. The camp commander, Joseph Kramer, had remained, waiting for the British arrival instead of fleeing. Perhaps he did not understand that by doing so he exposed himself to judgment and execution. He offered the British officers what he described as his cooperation. They received it with disdain. The British found two distinct zones. In the first, which the soldiers themselves called the Camp of Horror, there were about 40,000 men, women and children dying among mountains of corpses that no one had the capacity to bury. In the second zone, recently adapted from a nearby military training camp, another 16,000 inmates were hungry and sick, but had not been affected by the worst epidemics. The distinction was relevant for the medical teams that arrived days later, as it marked the difference between those who could be saved and those who probably could not. Military Rabbi Leslie Hardman entered the camp on April 17th and exclaimed that the dead were walking. The prisoner accompanying him corrected him without dramatics. "They are not dead," she said, "but soon they will be." That phrase contained a clinical accuracy that military doctors would confirm in the following days. Of the approximately 60,000 inmates found alive at Bergen-Belsen, more than 10,000 died in the weeks following liberation. They were too weak to survive even with medical care. Liberation had come too late for them. Lieutenant Colonel M.W. Gonin, a British medical officer, left in his report a description that has survived as one of the most direct documents of what Bergen-Belsen meant for those who saw it. Piles of naked corpses, a woman too weak to stand leaning on them while cooking over an open fire, men and women squatting anywhere to relieve the dysentery consuming them, another woman washing in water from a tank in which the remains of a child floated. Gonin was not writing literature, he was drafting a military report. The distance between the genre and the content said something about the magnitude of what he was documenting. The impact on British public opinion came through the radio. BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby broadcast his report from Bergen-Belsen on April 19, 1945. It became one of the most important radio moments in 20th century British history. However, the version that aired had been edited. The specific mention of thousands of Jews that appeared in Dimbleby's original text was removed before broadcast. The erasure of the Jewish identity of the victims was not exclusive to Soviet coverage. It was a pattern that would repeat in Allied coverage of multiple liberations, with consequences that took decades to be fully understood. 4 days before the British entered Bergen-Belsen, on April 29, 1945, troops from the 7th and 42nd American Infantry Divisions arrived at Dachau. It was the oldest camp in the system, founded in March 1933, weeks after Hitler came to power, and for 12 years it had functioned as the prototype on which all the others were modeled. Arriving at Dachau was not reaching the last link in a chain, it was reaching the beginning of everything. Before entering the grounds, the soldiers found something that stopped them. On the railroad tracks next to the camp was a convoy of dozens of freight cars. Inside, between 2,000 and 3,000 corpses. The prisoners had been transported from Buchenwald on a journey that had lasted 3 weeks, under extreme starvation conditions, without water, unable to move, dying one after another inside the sealed cars. That convoy, which was not the camp but the path to it, would become one of the most reproduced images of the liberation of Dachau. First Lieutenant William Cowling was one of the first to cross the gate alongside two journalists. What he described was not silence or static horror, but movement, a human avalanche of thin, dirty and hungry people who rushed at them, trying to shake their hands, kiss their hands or faces, simply touch their clothes. Some threw them into the air, shouting in dozens of different languages. Many cried. They were more than 30,000 people who had lived for years under a system designed to destroy them, and they were responding to the presence of two soldiers and a journalist with everything they had left. Dr. Marcus Smith arrived the next day with a team of displaced army personnel. His description captured something that military reports rarely managed, the sense of unreality of someone arriving without having seen anything like it. He noted that the stench was beyond experience, that they reacted with disbelief, that his driver said even primitive peoples give a dignified burial to their dead and the dead of their enemies. He closed his eyes, he wrote, and thought that this could not be the 20th century. But the reaction in Dachau was not only one of horror and compassion. Some American soldiers executed captured SS guards. The executions were documented, some filmed. They resulted in subsequent military investigations. It was one of the most difficult moral questions posed by the liberations. The violence of the liberators against the perpetrators was emotionally understandable to anyone who had crossed that gate, but it called into question the principles of the rule of law that the Allies claimed to defend. There was no easy answer. Priest Leland Loving described the first free roll call at sunset. 32,000 prisoners standing for the count, the first time in years that this occurred without blows or threats. On May 5, 1945, 3 days before the armistice, the 11th Armored Division of the American Third Army liberated Mauthausen in Austria, the harshest camp in the system according to the SS's internal classification. It had been established in 1938 next to a granite quarry on the banks of the Danube, and for 7 years it had received prisoners whom the Reich considered irrecoverable, the most severe category of the concentration camp system, reserved for those who were to die working. The quarry had a staircase of 186 steps that prisoners climbed carrying granite blocks. Those who fell were thrown from above by the guards or crushed by those coming behind. Survivors called it the paratroopers' staircase. George Sherman was 19 years old and from Brooklyn. He was on patrol near Linz when he noticed the smell. He had read something about the camps in the Stars and Stripes, but when he arrived at Mauthausen he had no words. Sergeant Major Albert Kosiek described what he saw on the other side of the fence. Hundreds of people who went crazy with joy, some covered only with blankets, others completely naked, men and women mixed. Some could not have weighed more than 40 pounds. The camp commander, Franz Zierreis, was located 5 days after the liberation. When the soldiers approached to arrest him, he opened fire. He was seriously wounded and died in an American military hospital after giving a final statement in which he tried to shift responsibility to his superiors and colleagues. It was the same pattern that would be repeated in the trials of the following years. The citizens of Mauthausen were forced to enter the camp and take charge of burying the corpses. It was the same decision Eisenhower had made in Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, to create witnesses who could not later deny what the regime had done just a few kilometers from their homes. The Ebensee subcamp, liberated the next day, added another dimension. There, thousands of prisoners had dug underground tunnels to house armament factories. When the Americans arrived, several survivors died trying to eat the food the soldiers offered them. Their bodies, after months of severe hunger, could not process it. The discovery of the camps did not end with Mauthausen or Dachau. It continued for days until the armistice and beyond. In the first days of May, American troops found Gunskirchen, another Mauthausen subcamp located in a forest in Austria, where the survivors were in such an extreme state that a young soldier recalled not being able to tell if he was speaking to a man or a woman. Wöberlin, in northern Germany, left the soldiers who discovered it with a smell they described as impossible to forget. Landsberg, near Munich, produced the same sensation in its liberators that what they were seeing could not be happening in the 20th century. The case of Neuengamme near Hamburg added a tragedy of a different nature. The SS had evacuated the inmates by loading them onto 3 ships anchored in the Lübeck Bay, the Cap Arcona, the Thielbeck, and the Deutschland. On May 3, 1945, the British Air Force, unaware that the ships were carrying concentration camp prisoners, bombed them. Between 6,000 and 7,000 people who had survived the camp died at the hands of the Allies by mistake 5 days before the armistice. It was one of the most disturbing episodes of the liberation period and one of the least remembered. The Nazi system had managed to kill its victims with enemy bombs in the final hours of the war. Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia was the last major camp to be liberated on May 9, 1945, the day after the formal armistice. It had functioned for years as a model camp used by the SS to deceive Red Cross inspectors about the real conditions of the concentration camp system. Behind that facade, it had also served as a transit camp to Auschwitz. Rebecca C., a Theresienstadt survivor interviewed decades later, expressed the paradox of the liberation with a clarity that no historical report could match. She was a person freed from the Holocaust who could not feel joy because she thanked God for surviving, but did not know how to thank him for having lost everyone. In the span of 6 weeks between April 4th and May 8th, 1945, the Allied armies had crossed the gates of dozens of concentration camps and hundreds of subcamps spread across Germany and Austria. What they had found was the result of a collapse, but also the material evidence of a system that had operated for 12 years with deliberate efficiency and systematic brutality. Each camp confirmed what the previous one had suggested. Each liberation expanded the understanding of the network, and the network was much larger, much older, and much more rational than anyone had wanted to imagine. The soldiers who survived those weeks returned marked in a way that conventional war had not produced. It was not just the horror of what they had seen. It was the difficulty of finding a language to convey it, the sense that the words available were insufficient to describe what their eyes had recorded. Dr. Marcus Smith had said it in Dachau. He tried to remember the redeeming attributes of man, and none came to mind. It was a phrase that captured more than the experience of a single camp. It captured the moment when a generation of soldiers, journalists and doctors discovered that the world they thought they knew was darker than they had imagined, and that this darkness had not been accidental but constructed, planned and executed methodically for more than a decade by a modern state in the heart of Europe. What came next, the aid to survivors, the trials, the collective mourning of a continent, would begin to be built upon that understanding. But first, one had to survive the weight of having acquired it. The SS burying corpses under British orders at Bergen-Belsen. When the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment crossed the gates of Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, the military war had ended for its soldiers. What was beginning was something else, a medical emergency on a scale no army had faced before, under conditions that no field manual described. The British military doctors who arrived in the following hours did not find a liberated camp. They found a camp in an active process of dying. Bergen-Belsen had been operating for months beyond any limit. Epidemics of typhus, dysentery and tuberculosis ran unchecked through barracks designed for hundreds of people that now housed thousands. There was no functional running water. There was no sanitation. Corpses had gone days, in some cases weeks, without being buried. What Brigadier Glyn Hughes, Chief Medical Officer of the 2nd British Army, described upon entering was a scenario where the distinction between the living and the dead was not always immediately visible. His initial estimates indicated that the camp would require medical resources equivalent to a city of 60,000 inhabitants in a state of total disaster. The British Army did not have them. The first decisions the doctors had to make were the ones no doctor wants to make. With limited resources and tens of thousands of patients, a triage system had to be established to determine whom to try to save and whom not to. The inmates were classified into categories according to their real chances of survival. Those too weak to survive, even with intensive medical care, were left outside the resources available. It was a clinical decision and also a moral decision of a severity that the doctors who made it would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Civilian medical students were urgently recruited from British universities. Local military training facilities were converted into field hospitals. An international Red Cross team arrived on April 17th. Despite all of this, more than 13,000 of the survivors found alive in the camp would die in the weeks following liberation. It was not negligence. It was the result of years of systematic destruction of the human body that no medical intervention could reverse in weeks. Feeding presented a paradox that the doctors took several days to fully understand. The soldiers wanted to give food to the survivors immediately. It was the natural impulse of any human being confronted with extreme hunger. But after months or years of severe starvation, the human digestive system cannot process normal food. Standard army rations, rich in fats and proteins, triggered in bodies in that state what medicine calls refeeding syndrome, a cascade of metabolic imbalances that could be fatal. The doctors of the 11th Light Evacuation Hospital developed in those weeks protocols for gradual caloric introduction that became a reference for later humanitarian emergency medicine. But before those protocols were established, some survivors died from what was meant to save them. It was the system's final cruelty. Its victims could die from an embrace. Within the camp, managing the immediate chaos required decisions that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The captured SS guards, about 80 men who had not fled before the British arrival, were put to work under military supervision. They were forced to transport corpses, dig mass graves, and clean barracks. Photographs from those weeks, many published in the British press, show men in SS uniforms dragging bodies under the watch of armed soldiers. It was an image the European public needed to see, and one that the British soldiers themselves found disturbing in a way different from the horror of the camps. There was something in it that did not fit any known category of war. Commandant Josef Kramer, who had remained in the camp waiting for the British to arrive, supervised these tasks before being formally arrested. He would be tried in the Bergen-Belsen trial in November 1945 and executed on December 13th along with 10 other defendants. Wehrmacht soldiers were also mobilized. Catholic chaplain Edmund Swift described what happened when a company of German soldiers was forced to work with the corpses. After placing about 24 bodies in a grave, a corporal tore the iron cross from his chest and stomped on it. The rest of the company did the same, silently, one after another. It was the gesture of men who suddenly understood, or pretended to understand, the nature of the regime they had served. Eisenhower's decision to force the German civilian population to visit the camps was carried out at Bergen-Belsen and at dozens of facilities across the Allied zone. Records of those days show groups of German civilians, mostly women because the men were at the front or in captivity, walking among the camp facilities with expressions that photographers captured with uncomfortable precision. Some cried. Others looked on with an indifference that could have been shock or could have been something else. Many later claimed they had known nothing. Others acknowledged having noticed the prisoner convoys arriving by train, the smoke visible from the towns, the smell that on windy days reached residential neighborhoods. Between noticing and questioning, there was a distance that many had consciously chosen not to cross for years, and that was now impossible to maintain. The Bergen-Belsen trials, held in Lüneburg between September and November 1945, were the first war crimes trials conducted by the British after Germany's surrender. 44 defendants appeared before the tribunal. Among them was Dr. Fritz Klein, a doctor who had served at Auschwitz, Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen. In his final statement, Klein admitted to being as responsible as those at the top of the system for the murder of thousands of people. It was an admission that the prosecutors had not expected in those terms. Klein was executed. Captain Franz Hössler, with a long documented career at Auschwitz and Dora Nordhausen, chose a different defense. He stated that it was unpleasant to be a Nazi, that he had joined the SS in 1933 because he was unemployed, and that he had tried to be kind to the inmates. The tribunal did not believe any of these claims. He was also executed. For the soldiers who worked at Bergen-Belsen during those weeks, Victory Day, May 8, 1945, was a moment of ambiguity difficult to describe. John Roger Dixie, a British medical student who had been working in the camp for weeks, recalled entering one of the barracks that day to announce in several languages that the war was over, that Germany had been defeated. There was no response, no cheers, no celebration. They just looked at him. Dixie then understood something the survivors had known all along. The war was over, but not for them. On May 21, 1945, the British burned Bergen-Belsen. The barracks had proved impossible to adequately decontaminate, and the decision to destroy them was sanitary, symbolic, and final. On the site where the camp had stood, a sign was placed in English and German. Here lie 10,000 dead people. It was only a fraction of the actual number, but it was what could be said in a single sentence. We are free, but no one is waiting for us anywhere. The plight of displaced Jewish people. The spring of 1945 ended the Nazi camp system, but it did not end the problem of the people who had survived it. In May 1945, there were between 8 and 10 million displaced persons in Europe. Forced laborers, liberated prisoners of war, refugees from multiple countries, and concentration camp survivors. Among them, about 250,000 Jews who had survived the Holocaust faced a question for which the Allies had no prepared answer: where were they going? Zalman Grinberg, a doctor and survivor of the Kaunas ghetto and several concentration camps, was appointed by the Americans to lead the Jewish survivors' hospital established in the monastery of St. Ottilien in Bavaria. 1 month after the liberation, in a speech to survivors gathered for the first free Shabbat celebration in years, he said something no one in the room could refute. "We are free, but we do not understand our freedom because we are still in the shadow of the dead." It was the most accurate description of the condition of hundreds of thousands of people in that European summer, free in the legal sense, without community, without family, without property, without a country to return to. The underlying problem was structural and also brutally simple. Most Jewish survivors could not return home because their homes had ceased to exist in any real sense. In Poland, where more than 3 million Jews had lived before the war, between 250,000 and 300,000 survivors remained in 1945. Their properties had been occupied by neighbors who did not expect anyone to return to claim them. Their communities had been physically destroyed, and anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe had not disappeared with Nazism. The Kielce pogrom, which occurred on July 4, 1946, in a medium-sized Polish city, demonstrated this with a clarity that admitted no interpretation. A Polish mob attacked Jewish survivors who had tried to rebuild their lives there, killing 42 people. In the months following the Kielce pogrom, tens of thousands of Polish Jews fled to the Western occupation zones in Germany and Austria. It was a second expulsion, this time without the SS. A Polish survivor interviewed in Italy in 1946 described it in terms that need no comment. He had returned to Poland, found strangers living in his apartment, and had found no family members. Of 7 people, only he remained. He left Poland 2.5 weeks after arriving and returned to Germany, where he helped establish an agricultural community in the Zegersdorf displaced persons camp. The institutional response to this situation was the system of displaced persons camps, the so-called DP camps, largely administered by the UNRRA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The Feldafing camp on the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria was the first designated specifically for Jewish survivors. It had been a Hitler Youth School. For survivors arriving at this and other camps in the system, the paradox was almost unbearable. After surviving the Nazi camps, many ended up in other camps, this time administered by the Allies on German soil, sometimes in the same barracks they had occupied as prisoners. Francesca Wilson, a UNRRA worker who arrived at Feldafing in May 1945, described conditions that, weeks after the liberation, were still extremely dire. The Harrison Report changed the political situation. Earl Harrison, the American representative on the Inter-Allied Refugee Committee, was sent by President Truman in the summer of 1945 to inspect the displaced persons camps. His report, delivered in August, was devastating. Many Jewish survivors were still living, in their own words, in conditions very similar to those imposed on them by the Germans, except that they were not being exterminated. Truman sent the report directly to General Eisenhower with a note demanding immediate improvements and pressured the British to authorize the emigration of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. The British, caught between American pressure, the obligations of their Palestine Mandate and Arab opposition, refused. That refusal had consequences that would extend for decades. The accumulated frustration of Jewish survivors with the Western powers, particularly with Britain, massively reinforced support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The displaced persons camps became active centers of Zionist organization and preparation for illegal emigration. When David Ben-Gurion visited the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in Munich on January 27, 1946, the first anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, he found a community that in overwhelming majority had reached the same conclusion. There was no future for Jews in Europe. In 1947, the ship Exodus attempted to carry 4,500 survivors to Palestine. The British intercepted it in Mediterranean waters and returned it to Europe, forcing its passengers to disembark in Hamburg on German soil. Images of that forced disembarkation went around the world and became one of the most powerful arguments for the international recognition of a Jewish state. The creation of the State of Israel in May 1948 was, among many other things, the direct result of what had occurred in the displaced persons camps during the previous 3 years. But while these political tensions developed, something happened inside the camps that outside observers found difficult to explain. Life not only continued, it asserted itself with an intensity that defied any reasonable expectation. In Bergen-Belsen, converted into a Jewish displaced persons camp after the British burned the original facilities, the KZ Tita operated, a theatre company performing plays in Yiddish for survivor audiences. One of its most popular pieces was called Partisans. Soccer tournaments were organized between teams from different camps. Yeshivas were established where young people who had spent years unable to study resumed learning the Talmud, and the rate of marriages and births in the displaced persons camps increased in a way that demographers of the time described as extraordinary. It was not optimism, it was something older and more resilient, the collective decision that the chain would not be broken. For many survivors, however, loneliness was the wound that none of these activities could fully heal. A Theresienstadt survivor, who would later become a rabbi, articulated it with a precision that no clinical analysis surpasses. After liberation, he said, he suffered more from loneliness and isolation than during the Holocaust itself. He was alive. But that was all, without knowing for whom or for what. Magda Blum, a 13-year-old Hungarian girl who arrived in the United Kingdom through the Survivor Children's Resettlement Program, had been liberated in Bergen-Belsen without even realizing it, because the night before her mother had died and the British tanks advanced down the street while she was being taken out of the barracks. For Magda and thousands like her, liberation had not been a moment. It had been the beginning of a life built on a loss that could not be repaired. What occurred in the displaced persons camps between 1945 and 1948 was not the epilogue of the Holocaust. It was the demonstration that its consequences did not end with the end of the war, nor with the destruction of the camps, nor with the Nuremberg trials. The integration of what happened into collective memory, international law, and the political consciousness of the 20th century would occupy the following decades. And in many ways, it remains unfinished. Margaret Bourke-White at Buchenwald, the camera as a shield against horror. The camps liberated by the Western Allies, especially Buchenwald, Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, were documented with unprecedented intensity. Photographs, film footage, radio reports, press articles. Margaret Bourke-White, photographer for Life magazine, was one of the first to document Buchenwald with a camera. Her images, published in Life in May 1945, reached millions of American readers. The photographer described her experience. "I used the camera almost as a barrier between myself and what I was seeing. It was a means of self-protection, because if I saw it without the filter of the viewfinder, I simply could not function." The camps liberated by the Soviets, despite containing the most evidence of the Holocaust, Auschwitz and Majdanek foremost, received much less coverage in the West. Journalist Alexander Wirth sent a report from Majdanek to the BBC that was dismissed as Soviet propaganda. The Illustrated London News was the exception, publishing images of Majdanek in October 1944, with the explicit purpose of showing that reports of Nazi crimes were not exaggerated. But the British press in general published the Soviet revelations about Auschwitz and Majdanek with a tone of distrust. One consequence of this was a lasting distortion in collective memory. Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald came to be the emblems of Nazi horror in Britain and the United States, respectively, even though neither was an extermination camp. The real extermination camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bełżec, Chełmno, where the Nazis had concentrated the machinery of genocide, had not left significant numbers of survivors, and their physical remnants were scarce. The public image of the Holocaust was thus defined by what the Allied cameras could photograph in the spring of 1945. Another persistent pattern was the difficulty in recognizing the specifically Jewish identity of the victims. Camp reports tended to present the victims in national terms, as Poles, French, Belgians, Soviets, omitting or subordinating their religious identity. Chief Rabbi J. H. Hertz wrote a letter to the Times of London on May 28, 1945, attempting to correct this point. His Grace the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his stimulating letter to his diocese, refers to the horrors of the concentration camps. But there are much vaster and unspeakably filthy Nazi horrors, and these have not been effectively made known to the British public. Therefore, it is not generally known that the Nazis exterminated 5 million Jews and millions of non-Jews in monstrous crematoria and gas chambers by machine gunning, beating to death and mass drownings. This invisibilization was not always intentional. Many of the soldiers and journalists who arrived at the camps genuinely did not know that they were witnessing the result of an extermination policy directed specifically against Jews as a group. But the consequence was that the genocidal dimension of the Holocaust took years to be fully integrated into the public narrative of the Second World War. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, helped establish a legal and narrative framework for the crimes uncovered. Survivor testimonies and documentary material from the concentration camps constituted a central part of the prosecution. However, even at Nuremberg, the destruction of European Jews was presented as one of several war crimes, not as the central axis of the Nazi criminal system. The word Holocaust, to specifically describe the genocide of European Jews, would not enter common usage until decades later. A controversial and frequently hidden fact is the reuse of some concentration camps by Soviet authorities in their occupation zones. After liberation, the Red Army and the new communist administrations established in several Nazi camps what became known as special camps, intended to detain those suspected of activities against the new political order under construction. Sachsenhausen was reopened as Special Camp No. 2, and Buchenwald, which had been liberated by the Americans but fell in the Soviet occupation zone, became Special Camp No. 7. According to figures released by the Soviets to the GDR government in 1990, 122,671 people were interned in these special camps. Of these, 42,889 died while in detention, and another 756 were sentenced to death. The conditions in these camps, although never comparable to the horror of the Nazi system, were very harsh. Their purpose was the social reorganization the communists were implementing in Eastern Europe, the destruction of the bourgeoisie as a class, and the elimination of any real or potential opposition to the new regime. By early 1950, the Soviet special camps had been closed. In the brief period of just 6 weeks from April 4th to May 8, 1945, the Western Allies liberated dozens of concentration camps: Ohrdruf, Dora-Nordhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenbürg, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, Ebensee, Gusen, Gunskirchen, Neuengamme, Wöbelin, Ravensbrück, and hundreds of subcamps in German, Austrian, and Dutch territories. The Soviets, between July 1944 and May 1945, had liberated Majdanek, Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Stutthof, Gross-Rosen, and Theresienstadt, in addition to taking the territories where the pure extermination camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Biušek had operated. The numbers of what was found were impossible to process in real time. In the Auschwitz complex alone, the Soviets found 7,000 survivors and evidence of the murder of at least 1 million people. At Bergen-Belsen, the British found nearly 60,000 people alive, of whom more than 10,000 died in the following weeks. At Dachau, the Americans liberated more than 30,000 inmates. In Mauthausen, between 15,000 and 16,000 people were awaiting their liberators. The 700,000 inmates registered in the camps in January 1945 had, after the death marches and the collapse of the system, become a much larger number of deaths and an incalculable number of survivors dispersed throughout Germany and Austria. It is estimated that at least 1/3 of the 714,000 registered in January died between that date and the German surrender on May 8th. The total number of people who passed through the camp system over its entire existence and the total number of deaths took decades of historical research to begin to establish with some accuracy. The soldiers, photographers, journalists, and humanitarian workers who entered these camps returned permanently marked by what they had seen. Vera Karoli, a Bergen-Belsen survivor, recalled, "Looking at the British soldiers who had come to liberate us. That look of absolute horror in their eyes I will never forget. It was obvious to me that they could barely distinguish between the piles of corpses lying there in the camp and the exhausted survivors." Edith Birkin, who later became an artist in England, remembered that the British soldiers were very young, the same age as me, some of them. They were horrified by what they saw in us, and who could blame them? Lieutenant Albert Huttler, displaced persons officer of the 7th American Army in Mannheim, wrote to his wife, "The war has officially ended, but there is not a great deal of enthusiasm here. It may sound horrible to say this, but there is not as much joy in my heart as I anticipated, because I fear for the peace." His fear was specific. They are free, but they are stunned. They are free, but in their hearts they will never be able to rid themselves of the last 5 years. Freddie Knoller, a Bergen-Belsen survivor, summarized what the moment of liberation meant for those who lived it. "The British had liberated us, but no one cheered. A ghostly silence marked the moment of our liberation. We were too weak and had lived too long to feel joy. It was only when the British distributed a bowl of rice and hot milk that we understood that perhaps one day we would be human again." The survivors themselves articulated the paradox of liberation with brutal precision. Hadassah Rosensaft, a Bergen-Belsen survivor, summarized it as follows: "Soon, the euphoria and hysteria ended. There was joy. Yes, we were free. The gates were open, but where were we to go? Liberation had come too late, not only for the dead, but also for us, the living. We had lost our families, our friends, our homes. We had nowhere to go, and no one was waiting for us anywhere. We were alive, yes. We were freed from death, from the fear of death, but the fear of life was beginning." The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps was not a single act, nor a moment of redemption. It was a prolonged, uneven, often chaotic process that ended the Nazi terror system, but did not immediately resolve the suffering of those who had endured it. What the Allies found in those weeks of spring 1945 was the visible result of 12 years of systematic barbarity, and its magnitude exceeded the capacity of understanding of those who came to witness its consequences. The integration of that reality into collective memory, historical knowledge, and international legal frameworks occupied the following decades and in many ways remains incomplete.